Hello, I'm Michael Voris.
And I'm Father Pablo, Catholic missionary priest. We really want you to watch every week the one true faith. Had you left that one true faith, please come home. We're waiting for you because we love you.
Hello and welcome once again to The One True Faith, the most disturbing hour on television because we talk about eternal life, the biggest, most important issue that any of us faces. And what we must never forget is that our eternal lives are determined by our earthly lives, the choices we make here. So, what we do now, what we believe now, how we treat other people now will echo throughout eternity and will be the deciding, determining factor of where we spend eternity. Now, this is a truth that must always be declared directly, forthrightly, because this is the heart of Christianity. This is the end game. We are created to be with Christ, and that is what we are striving toward, and that must be declared without ambiguity whatsoever. Eternity hangs in the balance in this life. Now, there are many, many sources of people and enemies of this message, with Satan behind all of them, that wants to prevent this message from being declared. And those sources must be challenged, and that is what this program is all about. You know, one of the biggest threats to the Catholic faith today is the ideology of secularism. Secularism, let's put it in its proper context here, comes from the Latin word meaning the world or this present age. And for those of you who are used to hearing some Latin in the Mass, when you hear secula, secularum, world without end, that's where the word comes from secular. The term secularism, as we have come to understand it now, modern culture, that word itself was coined in the 19th century by a British writer who was named George Holyoake. George was an agnostic. Boo. He was fresh from the Enlightenment philosophy also. The Enlightenment had just sort of taken off here and begun to develop and flower, and George was, Holyoake was right smack in the middle of it, you know, all that excitement of the halcyon days of the Enlightenment. Thank you very much, George. We're kind of sorry you were sort of hanging around coming up with your ideas. What he has to say about secularism is something that we can learn an awful lot about, because modern-day secularists are very content to pretend that this is just one more sort of thing out there in the culture. There's Christianity, there's this, there's that, there's secularism, This is all these different things. You know, it's a pluralistic society. If you want to be secular, you go over there and be secular. If you want to be Christian, you go over there and be Christian. If you want to sit over there and be an atheist, you be over there an atheist. And it's all fine. And there's room for all of this in a nice pluralistic society. Well, when you go back to he's not exactly the father of secularism, but he certainly did a lot of thinking and a lot of writing on it. So we're going to sit here and go over a few of the things he said. Here's the first thing he said. Secularism is not an argument against Christianity. It is one independent of it. Really? Well, hold on. There's no such thing as something that is independent of Christianity. Why? Well, because Christ, Jesus Christ, is God and has authority over all things. So, and many of you have heard me say many times that bad theology comes from bad philosophy. Well, here's another example of that. That his philosophical understanding, his political philosophy is wrong right from the get-go. It's absurd to think that there is just Christianity over on this part of the plate and secularism over here. Well, why? Well, because we'll hear some more things he says. By the way, everything is under Jesus' rule, as we know. There's no such thing as Christianity over here and it's just and this other thing, and the two have nothing to do with each other. That's ridiculous. This is precisely what Jesus Christ commanded us to go out and convert. So it's not independent of it. He may want it to be, but it's not. Another thing he said, next, we can say that his quote is, it does not question the pretensions, it meaning secularism, does not question the pretensions of Christianity, it just advances others. Secularism does not question the pretensions of Christianity, it advances others. Well, I'm a little insulted by that. So you're saying on the one hand, George Holyoake, that Christianity sits over here and secularism is over here, and they just kind of, that's fine, it's just over here being by itself. And then in the very next sentence in your kind of What is Secularism book, you say that Christianity is full of pretensions. Well, you're the one who's just married these two together in the sense of one attacking the other. First you say it's independent, then you say it's inferior to it. Actually, if you look at his kind of awkward sentence construction, he says that it doesn't advance Christianity's pretensions, or, it doesn't deal with Christianity's pretensions, it just advances others. Well, if he doesn't mean it advances other pretensions, but the way he's constructed the sentence, it does sound like that. So actually, I guess I would say on this one, not the way he meant it, but because of his rotten syntax, he's half right and half wrong. Let's continue to another one. He says, secularism does not say there is no light or guidance elsewhere, outside of itself, but maintains that there is light and guidance in secular truth, whose conditions and sanctions exist independently and act forever. Now, there's a big mouthful. Let's go over that again. Say that again, and you can listen to it again. He says that what truth and light and guidance there is in secularism exists inside secularism itself, inside the secular truths. That's ridiculous. Philosophically, again, look for those philosophical things. And don't forget the word philosophy. I should stop using that. Logic, common sense. Look for things that deny and defy common sense when somebody says something. What is secular truth based on? Why is something, if it's just inside here, true? If there isn't God and there isn't Christianity and all, what is your truth based on? You can't say, oh, it's just in there. Well, where did it come from? How did it get to be? How did we all come to recognize it? See, secularism doesn't admit of objective truth. It says that the truth is inside here because of our lived experience. We have another quote coming up in a second. But he means truth is independent of God. Remember, he was an agnostic, which I've got to imagine in the late 18th, early 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century, probably means you're, a practical atheist. You might say, well, I don't know, but how do you live your life? He probably wasn't so unsure that one Sunday he went to Mass and the next Sunday he didn't. That would be what a true agnostic would do, right? Just think about that for a second. A true agnostic who wasn't sure if there was God or not, wouldn't one Sunday he be in church and the next Sunday he not be? Because if you just don't go to church all the time, it looks to me like you've already made up your mind there's no God. So, question them on their very basic philosophies. Here's what he concludes. Secular knowledge, what we know in the world, is manifestly, clearly, that kind of knowledge which is found in this life, which relates to the conduct of this life, which conduces to the welfare of this life, and is capable of being tested by the experience of this life. That is subjective morality. That's all that is. It's all fancy sounding. He was a writer, he was a British writer, but when he got done with everything, all he meant is morality and what's good, and the truth, secular truth, is found in the secular world. And what's the secular world? Us. What's truth? What we determine truth is. What happens if we stop tomorrow determining that everybody over 50 has a right to keep on living? You know what? Then there's a new truth. Want examples of this? You don't even really need to think of them very hard, do you? Go back to 1936 Germany. Go back to 1938 Germany. The passing of Kristallnacht, 1936, the passing of the Reichstag laws. All of these things. When truth is dependent on man, it has dire consequences. Thank God there's a God. Thank God there's a God. When George Holyoake talks about this life, he means it apart from the life of the soul. He means a world without God. This is what secularism is. This guy isn't the father of secularism, but he's the writer. He was sort of the brain who kind of pulled it all together and wrote his little book on it and put the whole thing together and sort of gave it a voice. He didn't come up with the ideas, weren't his, but he kind of pulled all the ideas together from different, friends and sitting around the club and having drinks and thinking they're the masters of the universe and all of this, and they're so great and awesome and wonderful and nobody could be smarter than us. And so what we've sat around and figured out is what the case is. So he went to, Bob and Graham and Underwood and all sat down there and wrote down their thoughts and put them all together. And I'm sure he got all kinds of degrees and praise and invited to the finest cocktail parties in London. But it's all garbage. This has nothing to do with the truth. This has everything to do with passing truth, which isn't really truth at all. See, truth is either eternal or it's not true. Truth doesn't change. It can't change. But for the secularists, it must change. It has to become something different. It has to be something other than what it is. It has to be something other than what God intends it to be. It has to be, because it's subjective. As you sit here after a while and you keep doing all of this sort of delving into Catholic stuff, it's like jumping into a big pool, with a 90-foot bottom, and you just keep swimming. And the more and the more and the more you're in the water, the more and more and more you see that all these things are all the same. Secularism, hedonism, relativism, subjective morality, all of this stuff it's just all the same, it's a different label slapped over the same old piece of chicken that's on the turn. They keep slapping a new label on it, changing the expiration date, but it's the same lousy, rotten, spoiled meat. That's all it is. Why? Because it all comes from the same place. All comes from the same place. A very famous communist leader very early during the revolution said, when lots of people in the West were kind of supporting the Bolshevik revolution, and he was sort of joking with his communist and Bolshevik allies, and can you believe that these people over here in the West are actually supporting what we're doing here in overturning the Tsar and killing the family and establishing communism as the state government here? His Lenin, his answer was, well, that's all right. They're just useful idiots. He was perfectly content to have them hanging around and just, it's all right. I don't care if they don't understand exactly what we're doing. You know what? They serve our purposes. They're useful idiots. It's a great line. I've got to imagine that Satan spends 3/4 of his time in his morning meetings in hell going down his checklist of humans who are just useful idiots. Of course he does. So if we say, well, who cares what some 19th, early 20th century, British writer says about secularism, some agnostic guy, why should we care? Who should care? We should care. Ideas have consequences. Ideas get turned into words. Words get turned into consequences. The entire system that enslaved 1/3 of the world was built on words. Bolshevik communism, the Marxist revolution. Karl Marx never picked up a weapon as far as we know of it in his entire life. And yet the ideas in that man's mind that made it onto pages with words changed the face of the world for the next 150, 180 years. buried in some little obscure grave somewhere in London. Ideas have consequences. Oh yeah, they have consequences. A crazy, half-mad German corporal sat in a prison in Germany, Landsberg, and wrote a book called Mein Kampf. And 55 million people later died. 55 million people died because of what he wrote and his ideas in his head. Oh yeah, ideas have consequences. You betcha they do. And secularism has done more damage to the world than communism could ever dream of doing. First of all, communism as we understand it, and China is a separate story, I'm talking about in the West, the damage that has been done to the West because of secularism, communism couldn't hold a candle to it. First of all, communism in that sense doesn't exist anymore. There's various versions of it, kind of, but I mean, the whole, the Cold War, Russia and America, that has passed into history. Maybe it'll come back, but for right now it hasn't. But secularism is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of millions of babies through abortion. Communism didn't kill hundreds of millions of people. And communism in the West doesn't exist anymore. But every year, all around the world, about 100 million children are aborted because of the ideas inherent in the philosophy that underpins secularism. Every year, 100 million people die. It took Adolf Hitler 6 years to have 55 million people die. So do the math. Secularism, if you're going to count bodies, and just in this one area of abortion, secularism is 10 times as effective in bringing death into the world than Nazism. That's a pretty bold claim. That's a pretty bold claim. And more to the point, because of what's happening, we're going to talk about this as soon as we come back, but the untold number of souls that have potentially lost their eternal lives because of secularism is a far, far greater body count than anything that happens here on earth. Far greater. We're going to talk about this when we come back right after this. Welcome back to The One True Faith. We're talking about secularism. And secularism is sort of the accent, if you want to put it that way, on the big claim to separation of church and state here in the United States. Separation of church and state. People walk around and will blab that out and they don't have the slightest idea what they're even talking about. Separation of church and state. Well, the Constitution says separation of church. The Constitution doesn't mention the separation of church and state. You won't find it anywhere in the Constitution because it's not a constitutional principle, the separation of church and state, not in the sense that the people who use that term mean it. Separation of church and state was a term, a wall separating church and state, was a term used by Thomas Jefferson when he wrote a letter to a Baptist church in Danbury, Connecticut in the early 1800s. It was to capture the idea that what the church does independent of the government and doesn't need the government's sanction to be able to do it. Read the full letter. Go online and Google it. It was to the, I believe it was the Danbury Baptist Church in 1802. I might have it wrong, but if you Google Thomas Jefferson and his letter to the Connecticut church, you read the letter yourself. And for those of you who might have thought, oh, the separation of church and state is like the most hallowed thing we've ever had, the most important principle that's ever existed in American, in the American Federation of States, it's probably one of the least important. It's just right there in the Constitution. There is no, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the establishment of a church or the free exercise thereof, religion or the free exercise thereof. And it moves on. There's no great big elaboration about it. But for people who are secularists, you get to look at the Establishment Clause, they say, that part that says Congress shall make no law which establishes a church. So they focus on that. We'll see clearly the Founding Fathers were hostile towards religion. They wanted nothing to do with religion. Do you know before all this and after the Constitution, the states individually took up taxes to pay the churches. Find that in your American history book. It's there. Oh, but I mean, that would just, the American Civil Liberties Union would probably have apoplexy over that. Oh, you're not reading it right. The League for the Separation of Church and State, which, by the way, is run by some guy who calls himself a minister, Barry Lynn, can't have the influence of the church anywhere in the government. Well, as the government continues to expand and encroach and grow all over our culture with laws and rules and regulations and tax policies and government policies for this and that and everything else, so as it goes and as it grows, if religion can't have anything to do with that, well, every time government advances, that means necessarily religion must retreat. Perfect example, public education. Public education, which, when you say, oh, you know, such and such goes to a public school, call it what it is. It's a government school. That's what it is. It's a government school. It's paid for by the government. The people who work there draw their checks from the government, and they rule. Every rule in that place is never given credence unless it's approved by a governmental body. It can be a school board. You challenge it, it goes to court. Who solves it? The government. Public schools are government schools. We'll call them what they are. Public's a nice kind of varnish to make it sound like we all have some kind of control. We don't have any more control over public schools than if we were the president of the PTA. We have nothing to say about public schools. The government says them about public schools. If parents had the authority that they think they have in public schools, why can't you pray in a public school? I do this a lot. I mean, this is what I do. I look up research. This is what I do for a living. I find things out. I'm looking at things. I keep my hands very much in opinion polls and all of this stuff. I have never seen a poll in my life that says less than 75% of Americans want prayer in public schools. They always have. Since the I think it was 68, 65, whatever it was, Supreme Court ruling that struck down prayer in public schools. Even today, in one of the most secularist societies you could imagine, still 3 out of every 4 Americans wants prayer in public schools. Well, if they're public and the public wants prayer, how come there isn't prayer in the public schools? Because they're not public schools, they're government-run schools. That's why there's not prayer in them. How come there aren't 10 commandments posted in courtrooms? The public wants them. The public wants the 10 commandments posted. They always were. 10 commandments were always there. You know, you've got this sort of strange mix in the culture that here's a culture that was founded on partially, largely, at least Christian principles, if not Christianity per se. It was at least founded on the idea and heavily influenced with Christian principles. And how do we know that? Because the fingerprints of that is all over the culture. It's everywhere. You know, that's the reason that secularists have to go to court to remove 10 commandments from courtrooms is because they were in there in the first place, and they always have been. The reason the United States Supreme Court had to strike down prayer in public schools because it was already there. All of these things were already there. The reason every time some crazy case comes up with the ACLU and take that nativity set down, it's because it's already there. Because the community wanted it there. This isn't the case of like, hey, here's a piece of barren land and the secularists are fighting to not put a manger scene there and the religionists are sitting there saying, yes, put one there. It's already there. Because that's what the entire American culture was based on. This idea that, you know, there is a God. We mention him, that nature's God, right there, smack in the first sentence of our founding documents. All men are created equal. Well, who's doing the creating? Not us. The truth is outside of us. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. See, the founding principles clash with secularism. And yet secularism sits there and says, well, that's okay. We're not a threat. You know, we're over here doing our thing and you're over there doing your thing. No, you're not. No, you're not. Secularism has a goal of abolishing Christianity, or at least reducing it so greatly that it has absolutely no impact on the culture whatsoever. That's the goal of secularism. Well, it's a pluralistic society, Mike. You have to accommodate this person and that person. Why? Why? Why does every single person's particular individual tastes have to be accommodated? Why can't we pray at a public high school graduation? Because somebody might be offended by that? What about me who's offended at the absence of prayer? How come my offense doesn't matter? How come me being offended doesn't matter? If I took a poll, I'll bet you most of the people in the room at that graduation, more of them would be offended at the absence of prayer than would be who are offended at the prayer. So if that's the case, why isn't there prayer? Because secularists are not about accommodation. They're about, like every group in human history has always been, they're about control. It's my way and you can take the highway, period. And I don't care if that means you go on your way and you take your silly little religion with you, and that means you take down your Christmas trees and you take your things around. And some group got sued for walking down public streets singing Christmas carols that had religious words to them because they were on a public sidewalk doing it. This is nuts. This isn't just you're over there being your Christians and we're over here being secularists and hi, nice to see you, you go about your life and we'll go about ours. No, because what is secularism? You were heard at the beginning of the show. Secularism is about these like silly ideas of Christianity, and we got to get rid of them. This is a pluralistic society. How do you function in a pluralistic society? Too many Catholics, Catholic leaders and Catholic laymen have accommodated this nonsense. We just sit back and take it while the secularists keep marching on and electing their judges, electing their people who appoint their judges, and their judges little by little encroach and take your religion away little by, and every time you do go, well, it's a pluralistic society. Well, I'm not quite sure what to do. Well, you have to accommodate and get along with everybody. Well, it's not right for me to impose my religion. That's ridiculous. When you're not imposing your stuff, somebody's imposing their stuff on you. I don't know any two football teams that go out on the field fighting to win the game and each one of them sort of allows the other one to score points because they're nice. That's stupid. It's not the way the world works. It's not the way the world works. And when you look underneath all of this, America doesn't have to be around. Europe doesn't have to be around for, the battle of good and evil to continue to wage. It just so happens that on the stage of humanity at this time and place, this is where one of the battles is going on. 100 years from now, we have no idea if the United States will be here or not. 100 years from now, maybe somebody will dig up the DVD of this and say, hey, look at this ancient technology. And they'll dust it off and do all kinds of things and stick it in some machine and figure out how to read it. And they'll be sitting here watching this and go, wow, look at that. How did that guy know that we were going to be watching him 100 years after they were all dead? And he's going on it. What was America? Oh, yeah, I think I learned about that in history class. We have no idea if America is going to be here or not. That's not the point. God never promised to save nations. God promised to save individuals. And to the extent that we are fighting a culture, fighting a philosophy that says, Christians, shut up, we need to fight back. How do you fight back? By having these conversations with people you know, by writing letters to the editor. When somebody says something, when you're standing in line anywhere, anything, somebody drives by and you're walking down the street and you see some bumper sticker that says something, say something to the person. They're saying something to you. That's what the bumper sticker's on their car for. Oh, it's a pluralistic society. It's a free country. I have a right to free speech. And I have a right to react to your free speech because I have free speech too. Until the secularists get as much control and then I don't have it anymore. They'll go on and nag on about separation of church and state. What they mean is the church should have no role in the public life. So what's really at work here? A philosophy, as the founding father, if you want to call him that, George Holyoake, says, which calls the tenets of Christianity pretensions. That's not neutral language. That's not you sitting over there in your brown shirt and me sitting over here in my blue shirt and we're just sitting in the same room together disagreeing on what color's nice. I think your shirt is inferior and I want everybody wearing a blue shirt. And your brown shirt over there is pretentious and it needs to go. And I'm going to make sure it goes. That's what's going on. That's what's going on. And I'm sitting here and having a patriotic thing. I'm talking about how this impacts our faith life. Because the heart of what is being struck at here is the truth of Christianity. It's happening on a political battlefield, but what's being struck at is the truth of Christianity. Now, that might be accidental. That could just be an accident of history. You know, secularism sort of grew up in the Western world where Christianity was predominant. So maybe secularism, like a dog, has a particular itch about Christianity. Just can't stand Christianity because it grew up around it and sort of in reaction to it. But I sort of tend to think that it's really not accidental at all. Insofar as the actual truth that is being challenged is the truth of Christianity, secularism takes dead aim at the truth itself, denying that there is a truth. And since Christ is the truth, man has in effect attacked God. Secularism, therefore, necessarily supports and spreads the philosophy of pluralism because it needs to. Pluralism is an idea that every position must be countenanced and accommodated in society, which means there's nothing right and there's nothing wrong. Everything must be accommodated. You know what? If you're a Christian, you cannot hold that position. You cannot hold that position if you believe in Jesus Christ. If you believe Jesus Christ is divine and you believe He is the Son of God, you cannot say that anything goes in your life or in society. Because you know what? You have children, and your children have children, and they grow up in this society, and they're going to be influenced by it even if you're not. You cannot countenance that anything can be accepted in Christianity by being a Christian. Can't be done. That's moral relativism. You have the truth, and I have my truth. Your truth, my truth. No Christian can accept that. You can't accept that. Political decisions get made in this environment of pluralism, which then work their way down into the life of the common men and women and then their families. And this is the danger. If this was just something somebody was arguing about on a debate team somewhere on C-SPAN, nobody would care. But it's not. It comes to life in laws and legislation. Secularism leads to accommodation, which encourages pluralism, which absolutely relegates Christianity to sort of first the back of the bus and then off the bus. Secularism then is the sum total of all the bad isms from the past 300 years. Hedonism, relativism, modernism, all rolled up into one giant cannon that man has aimed directly at God and fired. When we come back, we're going to take some questions from the studio audience. Be right back right after this. Back to the One True Faith. This is the part of the show where we take questions from the studio audience. Today we're talking about secularism. Hi, what's your name? Where are you from?
My name is Mary. I'm from Detroit.
Hi, Mary.
Hi.
What's your question?
If a pluralistic society is supposed to accommodate all views, how come it cannot accommodate Christian views?
Because it's not really about accommodating all views. A pluralistic society can't live with a viewpoint that says what you are doing is evil. That's it. So a pluralistic society is at war with a society that is based on Christian values. Now there are some things, little scattering here and there of pluralistic stuff that's, okay, but the point is just left to its own and left to its own Christianity, these two are going to have a collision course.
So they don't
they're going to.
So they don't actually accommodate at all.
They don't accommodate at all, no. They accommodate anything until it doesn't accommodate their viewpoint. You know, it's like me being tolerant until I think that you're intolerant, and now I'm not tolerant of you being intolerant anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, what's your name? Where are you from?
Chet Ostrowski from Berkeley.
Hello, Chet. What's your question?
If 3 out of 4 people, or 75%, want prayer in school and other Christian beliefs involved in public life, how do these minorities who oppose it get their way so often?
Well, you know, it's actually a very clever process. They realize that most people aren't engaged. Most people don't get involved on a kind of deep thinking level. They realize this. These people are very smart. They're very, well, they're too smart by half when it comes to eternity. But down here, they're smart. They understand what their goal is. They move towards it. They do whatever they need to do, and they're determined. You know, Archbishop Fulton Sheen used to say about the communists, because when he was, you know, very big and popular in the 50s and the 60s, and there was the big red threat, he used to talk about that all the time, and he said, communism has all zeal and no truth, and the Catholic Church has all truth and no zeal. There is a wonderful line in the parable of the weeds and the wheat, where Jesus says that it was while they were sleeping that the enemy came and sowed the weeds, and that's the case. You know, we're sitting here. This is how the society is. Oh, this is wonderful, and it. You know, we've heard all of these analogies before. You know, it's the slow boiling water with the frog in it. It's the, you know, you're asleep at the switch. You weren't paying attention. It's all of these things. Evil doesn't take a rest, and if Christians, if Catholics think it does, well, then they need to go back to the catechism. They need to understand that and go back to scriptures where Paul says, you know, the devil's roaming around like a roaring lion waiting for someone to devour, looking for someone to devour. That doesn't end. Satan doesn't go on vacation, and we can't either. Exactly. We're always battling while we're here. It's but because we put down the truth that all of these things advance. And so what do? Well, they get their people elected, and who then appoint judges, who then get these things through. And, you know, there's no such thing as an objective judge. It doesn't exist. He's a human being. She's a human being. They were born and raised in a set of circumstances. They might sit there and quietly try to be objective and think about being objective, but there's no such thing as an objective human being. How can there be? Exactly. It's impossible. Right. So they get their people elected. When they want to get when they want to run through some teenage girl who wants to have an abortion, you know what? They pick and choose the judges they know will grant them the abortion. They don't go to Judge Smith because they know he's Catholic and he's conservative and he'll never do this. So they go over here to, you know, Judge Jones, and Judge Jones will say, "Yep, oh yeah, absolutely, yeah, sure right." Slash the gavel on, you know, pronounce death sentence on that child, and move on to the next case. And they know it. It's a system, like everything. It's a system. Look how the Pharisees ran Jesus through the system of Roman justice. So, you know, this is how it happens. It's a system, and the people who want to manipulate the system are very good at it. They've learned how to do it, and the rest of us are sleeping, and that's our fault.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, what's your name? Where are you from?
I'm John Snyder. I'm from Madison Heights. How are you?
Doing well. How are you, John?
Doing well. Question for you. You were quoting earlier, George
Holyoke.
And he was referencing several different points where he was saying, this life. Whose life? I mean...
The temporal life of the world, of culture, this is it. There is an agnostic can't talk about eternal life because he at least isn't sure about it, and probably in practice, in reality, denies it, at least in the way he or she decides to live. Right. So when he's talking about this life, that we need to advance secularism in this life, and what are the truths of secularism? Well, they're what we find in this life. It means, this life means you. You tell me what truth is. Go ahead, tell me something that's true.
Okay.
All right, you know, and if it's not true for you, well, you know, okay, well, if it's true for you, it might not be true for me, but that's okay. Because we're a pluralistic society. We have plural opinions. We don't have single opinions of what truth is. We have plural opinions of what truth is. So you have an abortion, or take your girlfriend to go have an abortion, and I won't, and both things are fine. That's what he means by this life. It ultimately means there is no truth.
So by definition, there isn't a person who is this life. I guess Christianity would kind of point to Christ and say, this is this life that we're basing everything upon.
It's interesting, you know, this is so many times you read some of these things and you go back and you think about something Jesus said, and it's like, oh, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And here's a system set up proposing to be this life. Well,
Right.
this life ain't this life.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not even going to say it. What's your question?
Hello there, Mike. On the eve of the conclave to select the 264th successor to St. Peter, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger warned in his homily about a dictatorship of relativism in modern society. Seeing as he was elected Pope, why do you think the Church, his warning has been largely ignored in the Church today?
Well, I'm not sure that it is largely ignored in the universal church. I think there are certainly pockets within the universal church, as there's always been. I mean, go back to the apostles. I mean, Judas was ignoring what Jesus was saying. There's a long history of this sort of thing in the church. But I do believe that there are various groups of people and different dioceses, because of the bishops that are there, who are good, holy, solid men. And they see this, and they're probably like, hey, you know what? Good for you, Benedict. You're standing up here. You're saying it like it is. I can come out a little more. I can come out and say this. I can rearrange the faculties at my seminary and say, you know what? I want you teaching these guys who are going to be in charge of these souls the truth, like the hard facts, the factual truth, that Jesus Christ said this and he didn't say that. You can't accommodate evil. You can't accommodate lax morals. That there is the truth, objective morality. And we're going to explain it to you, and you get on board with it. And if you don't get on board with it, like Jesus says, you shake the dust from your feet and you move on. That there are pockets of this. This whole show we're watching is a result of this kind of thing. That this whole ministry that we do here at St. Michael's. A lot of people don't like this. A lot of people don't like hearing this. I don't care. I don't care who doesn't like hearing this. I don't have to please anybody else except Almighty God. And that's not to say that, look at me, I'm God's chosen messenger. That's to say that I'm not saying anything that the Catholic Church hasn't taught for 2,000 years. Nothing that comes out of this ministry says anything other than what the Church has taught for 2,000 years. And we're darn proud of that. But the world doesn't want to hear that, and certainly lots of pockets in the Church don't like to hear this. Oh, he's mean. Mike's a meanie. Yeah, no, Mike's not a meanie. Mike wants you to be in heaven. And what you're hearing from a lot of people, not just some wayward Catholics, but a culture that wants to say that your religion is stupid, shut up, go be separate, vote this way, doesn't matter what you believe, there's no such truth. You know what? To let that happen, that's mean. The meanest, most merciless thing you can do is let somebody live in a lie. That's the most merciless thing you can do. The most loving thing you can do is reach out and help them. And that's what we do here. People don't like it? Oh, well, too bad.
Thank you much.
Thank you. We'll be right back right after this. Well, welcome back to the One True Faith. Some closing remarks here. If you're a regular watcher of this show, you've heard this 1,000 times. If you're not a regular watcher of the show, well then sit back and listen to this little pearl of wisdom. We're in a fight to the death for the truth. And the world is proposing one truth to you. And Jesus Christ told you, if you love him, that the world will hate you. And the world will not want to hear the truth that you are propounding, because that truth is Jesus Christ's truth. That doesn't matter. You get out and you preach the truth. You take up your sword, you take up your weapon, you take up your prayer, you make yourself as holy as you can possibly make, with the grace of God, obviously, and do whatever you have to do to express the truth as best you can in your circumstances, because that is what your baptism is all about. You don't get to go to heaven by yourself. You're commanded to take other people with you to heaven. That's what it is. You go out, you preach, you be witnesses, you do whatever you have to do to make sure that the truth gets propounded, and you leave the rest to Almighty God. Somebody asked me once, well, what happens if I got an email on this a couple of weeks ago? What do I do if I say blah, 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 and it doesn't happen? Or what if I do this? And the answer is we're not told to be successful. God told us to try. Mother Teresa said that. We're not told to be successful. We're told to try. Another show we were talking about prophets, and not one of the prophets, with the exception of Jonah, who was the most reluctant prophet, not one of the prophets was successful. Successful in the sense that when people went and told their message, heard their message, they responded to it. Only Nineveh, and they weren't even the Jews, only Nineveh responded positively to the message. All the rest of them forgot, they didn't want nothing to do with it. But they did what God wanted them to do. And that's the only thing we are charged to do, is to do what God has told us to do. All the rest of it, we leave to God.